Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, John O'Sullivan. Please welcome Minister Anna Maria Anders, Lee Edwards, and President Václav Klaus.
And I think the Vice President.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have before us an extremely interesting panel, which has been provoked by an extremely powerful and interesting speech. And I would like to, I don't need, I think, to introduce either President Klaus, who's just spoken, or Lee, who's spoken earlier, but perhaps I could just welcome in particular Anna Maria Anders, who is here today. And she represents her country as a senior diplomat, a kind of ministerial diplomat for dialogue throughout the world and throughout Europe. But she's also, I think, like Paula Dobriansky in the earlier panel, she represents something important as well, and that is that the end of the Second World War and the betrayal of Poland at Yalta left a great number of Poles in Western Europe and in the United States, just as the Hungarian Revolution in '56 meant the expulsion of a large number of Hungarians who came to all over the world, but particularly to Western Europe and the United States. And their significance, the significance of these communities in our countries during the Cold War, in my view, can't really be overestimated. I went to school with boys with Polish names, the sons of Polish soldiers and flyers, and it's true to say, I think, that in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and maybe later, somebody on the left could not plausibly mount a defense of the Soviet Union or of its allies if there was a Hungarian or a Pole or a Czech in the room. They were, simply by being present at a dinner party or a conference, they were a rebuke to appeasement or to moral equivalence. And so I'd like to welcome you particularly today here. Now, having said that, I think we have to begin our discussion by asking first Anna Maria and then Lee to respond to the remarks of President Klaus, because they were powerful, but they were pessimistic. They recognized great achievements, but described a world in which those achievements were decaying or had been overthrown. And I think we have to deal with that first, and we'll go on to other questions, of course. But perhaps I could ask Anna Maria for a response.
Well, I think let me begin by saying how grateful I am to have this opportunity to be here today. I think the timing of this conference is particularly fruitful since Poland is so much in the news due to our president's visit here in Washington last week. Ironically, the situation is similar at a time when we're talking about allies between the United States and Poland. We're thinking back on President Ronald Reagan and the Pope. As John said, I was born in the UK when John Paul II was elected. I was in Paris, France. When Ronald Reagan was elected, I was in Paris, France. I was then only a British national. So many years later, I am an American citizen. I married a US colonel, and I'm also a Polish citizen, and the last 3 years I am a Polish politician. I think the situation is similar. I think the thing that for me is the most important, and I have heard very many important comments here this time, is the lack of the knowledge of history. I am appalled, traveling around the world, how little is known about history. I am appalled about the fact that so little is said about communism. We hear the word communism, I don't know how many times here today. We're not hearing that. We're not hearing that, and it's not just about the young people. It is the older people. I am stunned that there are people in the United States of a certain age who don't even know that Germany invaded Poland in 1939. let alone the deportations from Poland, 1.3 million people that were deported to Siberia. And my father, I am honored to say, saved 120,000 people by taking them out of Siberia, many of whom are still alive. Their offspring is alive all over the world. I have taken this conference very seriously because I'm my father's daughter. He was probably one of the most staunchly anti-communist people of note in latter years. And I feel that it is my obligation to talk about that. Moving forward, I think history, definitely, we have to learn about history. But I think we also have to examine the two people who made such an impression on the world. Both had incredible charisma. I was amused to hear about the remark that, they were both actors, and if you're on the stage, use that stage. And I think, unfortunately, the world today does not have that kind of actor. I think we have people who are stronger politicians, less strong, but we do not have anybody really with that charisma that is able to carry the inspiration and the world with it. How you can do it, I don't know. But I, as somebody in the Polish government, I am most concerned about the security of Poland. So the concern is the same as it was. We talk about US bases, NATO bases in Poland. We talk about Nord Stream 2. And we are trying to talk about it diplomatically. And I think the most important thing is the transatlantic cooperation. I think moving forward, that is the thing that will stand a chance to make the world go forward in the way that Ronald Reagan and John Paul II would like to have it go.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could turn to Lena and ask this question. Again, it's in the light of the remarks of President Klaus. Do you think, Lee, that the outcome of the post-Cold War world would have been different if Ronald Reagan's presidency had ended not in the end of 1988, but let us say in 1990, because the reward for Reagan's diplomacy and strategy towards the Soviet Union came later under George Bush. And though I think practically everybody admires the skill of the diplomacy that the Bush administration carried out, nonetheless, there was no sense that a great triumph of liberty and the freedom of Western society had been achieved. We played it down. Would it have been different?
Well, I think that even in America and certainly in Eastern and Central Europe, there was jubilation. There was not just dancing and champagne toast on the top of the Brandenburg Gate and the Berlin Wall, but elsewhere as well. Who can forget Leonard Bernstein conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and with that magnificent thing, Ode to Freedom, not just Ode to Joy. So I think that there was a very explicit celebration at that time. But getting to the question of how to respond to the president, let me put it to you this way. I think there are certain lessons to be learned from this partnership, this alliance that we've been talking about all day. And I'd like to set them out, if I will, briefly. Number one, ideas matter. They do matter. And that it's not just a question of power for power's sake. It is not just a question of dealing and bowing down to realpolitik, but that ideas matter. And that made a difference in the minds of both Ronald Reagan and also John Paul II. Number two, friends and allies matter. You can't do it alone. And both Reagan and John Paul II realized that it cannot be just one single power, even the great mighty United States of America. Friends and allies matter. Three, this has almost been a day-long mass in one sense. With the very real presence of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In other words, God matters. And that was certainly one thing which came out very, very clearly in this. It mattered to Reagan, it mattered to John Paul II, and mattered to so many of the people around them. 4, morality matters. Both Ronald Reagan and John Paul both understood that what was involved here was a moral struggle, and that there was not a moral equivalence between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States, between the forces of democracy and the forces of communism. 5, and I think this perhaps is the most important, leadership matters. You must have the right leaders. You must have men and women who dare to speak out against tyranny and Big Brother. You must have leaders who are both charismatic and courageous, and who are driven by not just their own place in history, but trying to change history for everyone. And I think those 5 lessons of ideas, friends, God, and leadership and morality can lead us to a way forward, and perhaps leaven a little bit the pessimism from President Klaus.
Then I'm bound to ask the question. I'm about to ask the question, if that is the case, how have we reached our present condition as described by President Klaus? In other words, do we not have those things now? Do we not have, for example, God, in the sense that when the European Union was drafting a constitution, there was a long debate about whether to include in God, but not only God, but the contribution of Christianity to European history in the preamble, and it was decided not to. Now, it turned out the Constitution was defeated in an election, so that never became a live issue, so to speak. But it's a very revealing moment, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but I think also you recall what Václav Havel said, and talking about in the Parliament address, the UE Parliament, he's talking about looking back. If we really want to talk about the right kind of Europe for the future, he said, it must be a Europe which looks backwards to Western civilization. And that includes the Romans, the Greeks, the Jews, antiquity as far back as we possibly can. I think that we can learn lessons from that, and I think we can learn lessons from that by looking to all the way to Poland. Certainly, the role of a being, a transcendent being, is very much apparent. If we look to Hungary, if we look to the Czech Republic, as I think you said earlier, Mr. President, that there is a very real religious, I won't say fervor, but presence there in the Czech Republic, and I think elsewhere as well. I think if you look and take a look, John, at these 5 conditions, these 5 lessons, that yes, some are weaker, some are stronger, but they do exist and they will come about with the right leadership. I think that's key. I think that's the most important thing. You must have the right leaders to make these come about.
I have one point before we go to President Klaus, and that is that at the end of the Cold War, it was agreed in the United States that everyone had been responsible for the victory. The Republicans and Democrats left and right. Now, that was certainly true for the period of Truman to Kennedy, and even arguably to LBJ. But it doesn't seem to have been, to me at least, quite so true for the period after 1968. When, along with other institutions, the Democratic Party fell under the sway of 68ers, and the same developments occurred in Europe. So that at the end of the Cold War, people were claiming credit for a victory for freedom and liberty, which many of them had been, at the very least, members of the peace movements, for example, ambiguous about the struggle. And didn't that agreement, in a sense, not to be honest about how the war had been won and by whom, doesn't that disable some of the peace now? And isn't that partly responsible for the disappointing developments that have occurred in Europe since then?
Well, you know, John, I'm an optimist. I'm a Reagan optimist. I always have been, always will be. If that were the case, we wouldn't have a memorial to the victims of communism just a couple of blocks from here. I worked at that for 20 years. Thank you very much. And they said for 20 years it can't be done, and I said it can be done and it will be done. With regard to a bipartisan approach, I'm happy to remind you, and you know just as well as I do, Scoop Jackson and Jackson Vanik made a tremendous difference. Joe Lieberman was somebody who spoke out very much. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, the number 2 Democrat in the House of Representatives, Steny Hoyer, is an anti-communist and did accept our Truman-Reagan Medal of Freedom and spoke at our founding next year after we founded the Victims of Communism Memorial. So I think there are bright spots there. I don't disagree with you that there are problems, that there are flaws, but there are many, many things to applaud.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that everybody was so busy patting each other on the back for the victory over the Cold War that nobody actually saw the next hurdle coming. And it was, Poland was treated as, you know, somebody who was overreacting when we were talking about Russia, when we were talking about Putin. It was the Crimean War that actually, not the war, but, you know, the takeover of Crimea that made the world wake up. And really, in the United States too, there was a reduction in arms. We're only now beginning to pick up from then. Everybody felt that the whole Cold War was over forever. We are, well, I don't know, are we in a Cold War now? We're certainly not in a friendly situation. But I think we have not been able to prepare. I think that is the real problem.
President Klaus, important moment in the post-war world occurred in 2009, when I think 22 distinguished European intellectuals and political leaders sent a message to the U.S. administration, then under the control of President Obama, in a sense appealing for a greater U.S. commitment to not Europe as a whole only, but also particularly to Central Europe, whereas they said America had some of its strongest allies. And that was that appeal was in effect ignored. Now, in your view, what should the American government have done? And particularly, do you see a gradually declining interest between in Europe from the US, and particularly, how does your pessimism stand up against these optimists?
First, I really don't accept the label of being a pessimist. You know, this is absolutely untrue, and I would strongly differentiate a pessimist from an realist, and I am absolutely sure that my approach is realistic. I am not an advocate of daydreaming. I am not an advocate of wishful thinking, and therefore I always try to be realistic. This is my first point, which I would like to stress. Your last point was about what should be my advice, my recommendation to the United States. John, we understood that we should give advice to us, to ourselves. We shouldn't pretend to be clever enough to give advice all over the world, and therefore I am not recommending anything to the United States of America. That's my point. As Lee Edwards mentioned his several preconditions. One of them is ideas matter. I fully agree, more than anything else. And in case of Ronald Reagan, John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, it was just the case. They were not just pragmatists doing government job as daily business. They were ideologues and they were optimists, and they have strong views and strong ideas. So I fully agree that ideas matter. But what does it mean if we look at the world around us, if we look at our politicians, both here in Western Europe in Eastern Europe. Are there any ideas among contemporary politicians? I don't see anyone with strong views, strong ideas. And if there are ideas, they are ideas which are for me totally unacceptable. The politicians advocate post-democracy, post-nationalism, I don't know what else, pro-Europeism, and so on. So I am absolutely convinced that ideas matter. Really, more than anything else. In this respect, I am an idealist, definitely. But I am afraid that there are no great ideas among the current politicians. So that's my pessimism, and therefore I don't see some hopeful tomorrows or days after tomorrows. Who will do it? Excuse me, to be that realistic.
Well, let me say that I want to come back to break that down into several areas, but Anna Maria, you want to come in.
So let me put my American hat on for a minute. I am a Polish politician, but I'm a US citizen. And I feel since I'm a US citizen, perhaps I can give some advice to the US government. I think that the US government, the United States, has to make sure that Europe is safe. An unsafe Europe is trouble for the United States because Europe is unable to cope on its own. We've seen through history. We've seen it in 1995 in Bosnia. The United States had to step in. And we've seen it obviously in the Second World War. So I think we cannot run the risk. The alliance between the United States and Poland is very, very good. The alliance between the United States and the rest of Europe at the moment is not that good. The relationship between Poland and the rest of Europe is not that good. I think we need another Ronald Reagan, we need another John Paul II, we need another Margaret Thatcher and another Gorbachev to make this happen, because we don't have the right players to, at the moment. We talked a lot about transatlantic alliance. I was at the CEPA conference the other day. Absolutely. But at this moment, I have more faith in a transatlantic alliance than I have in a European alliance, because all the countries in Europe are divided. Until Europe can work together, we cannot unite, and it's very, very important.
I'd like to come back to all of those points quickly. If we're talking about a lasting legacy, the legacy would, let's break it down into economics, religion, we're talking about the Pope as well as Reagan today, and politics, and in particular democracy. But let's deal with religion first in a way, because no one on the panel here is a theologian. But I know at the end of his life, the Pope was depressed by the extent to which Central and Eastern Europe had not, in a sense, revived the belief in Christianity in Europe as he had hoped once communism had gone. And in fact, one could argue that Eastern and Central Europe had been, so to speak, infected by the anomie and depressiveness of the West, rather than enjoying its prosperity to a full, and indeed not getting the prosperity. So the first question I would like to put to all three of you quickly is, is the Pope's disappointment understandable, correct? And if so, how should we respond to it? He felt that Christianity was decaying faster rather than it had before. That maybe Christianity had been strengthened by the oppression of the communist system. I doubt that myself, but it's an argument. But at the end of the 15, 20, 25 years, how do we feel that Christianity in Europe is doing after the great effort made for it by Pope John Paul II?
Not great. Generally not great. I think in Poland, religion was what kept Poland going during the communist years. And the fact that St. John Paul II came along, and I mean, it was definitely instrumental in the solidarity movement. And the church in Poland is still pretty strong, not as strong as it used to be. But that doesn't go for the rest of Europe, and it certainly doesn't go for the rest of the world. I think the problem is that we see Christianity suffering all over the world now with the rise of Islam, and really nobody is coming particularly to their aid, which is, and I think if St. John Paul II were alive today, if he were depressed then, I think he would be even more depressed today.
And it's fair to say, I think, that most European governments, not all as we know, most European governments have not responded with enthusiasm to the cause of persecuted Christians. They have wished it would go away. Would you like to add anything, Lee?
Well, I think one of the most touching things that I heard today was the story of the Pope in Zaire. And I think that's where the future, was one of the futures for not the Catholic, I happen to be Catholic myself, for the Catholic Church, but for Christianity. I think that there is a rising, there is an explosion, there is an awakening throughout all of Africa in a belief in God, in both Protestant, evangelical pursuits, and also in terms of Roman Catholic. And so I think the image which is remaining in my mind is not what you refer to as the Pope's pessimism, but the Pope reaching out to that little child in that hospital in Zaire and rocking it in his arms and loving it and caressing it. It seems to me that that is a more likely image. Yes, we're in a crisis. Yes, there are problems here in America and also elsewhere. It looks as though the bad guys are on the rise and are advancing. But history tells us that it is precisely at a critical time like this, in a time of crisis, that leadership arises, that the people come together. And I don't want to get into politics and give you specifics, but I can name several very charismatic, courageous politicians, political leaders who are under 40, whom you will be hearing about in a very short period of time.
Good. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, I don't know. First, as someone who, as compared to Our Lady here, who spent still 2/3 of his life in communism, so I would like to argue that the fighting of communism, at least in our part of the world, was not done with the Catholic Church ideology on our mind. That was one of the aspects of the people who were opposing communism and who wanted to bring communism to an end, to expect that the fall of communism would mean the renewal of Christianity and of the devotion to the Catholic Church was a naive assumption, and I think it's almost not worth discussing now. Okay. Second, I'm afraid that the Catholic Church with the popes created some problems as well. I think that John Paul II was able to inspire all of us, not only true believers in Catholic religion. I'm afraid that the new Pope is damaging all that credibility with his very leftist, very progressivist, very, very pseudo-liberal views, which he's defending all over the world. So this is for me a fatal blow to the Christianity and to the Catholic religion. So don't blame the people in Central and Eastern Europe for not jumping on Pope Francis bandwagon. Yeah.
So on that question, it's optimism one, realism two. Let me now.
But I would just add this, John, that that Jesus Christ left someone behind when he left, and who's still with us, called the Holy Spirit. And Catholics believe that the Holy Spirit will be there and is there and is guiding. Now, it may very well be that the outcome is not going to be one that we're going to like, but we do believe that there will be one which will, in the end, will bring about a more Christian and a more believing world.
Better world.
And that has been the case.
I'm sorry.
I that's true, but I definitely have to blame the Catholic Church itself as well. You know, some 15 years ago, I, as president of the country, vetoed the new bill about the so-called registered partnership. Catholic Church was silent. I, as president, vetoed the bill, and then I met the Confederation of Czech Bishops, and they were saying me, "Thank you very much. You are so brave for doing that, you know." And I said, "Excuse me, I expected that you would be loud enough to protest against that, not waiting for my vetoing that bill." So it's always more complicated.
One more comment. Excuse me, John, just one more comment. And that is that I agree with Václav. And the problem is the bishops. And the bishops were the problem that you were working with. And the bishops are the problem now. And unless they act, and I think they better act, then the people are going to rise up, and you may see a different kind of church in the years ahead.
I would never dare to blame the bishops. Excuse me.
I think I'm going to try to sum up this particular bit of discussion by saying that there are times, and the Reagan, when the hand of providence is clearer than other times. The Reagan, Thatcher, and John Paul II time, the hand of providence was, I think, much clearer than it is today. And
I just want to have one remark. Yeah. I think what the President said was that John Paul II was able to inspire everybody. Yes. There was an exhibition yesterday in the shrine of St. John Paul II, which I looked around, and even though I know the story, I must say that I was fascinated. Photographs of him with thousands and thousands of people. Now, you know, I didn't live in the United States when Ronald Reagan was president, so I don't know what kind of divisions you had. But it seemed to me that one thing that they had in common was be able to work across the aisles. And certainly you see John Paul II working with religious leaders from all over the world, and you see Ronald Reagan working with leaders all over the world. I think this is a problem. This is a problem which certainly exists in Poland. It exists here in the United States. So I think apart from the fact that we need a leader who's charismatic, I think we really do need a leader who is able to work with everybody.
Thank you. Now, we don't have a great deal of time left, so I'd like to sort of hurry the debate along and bring in the question of economics, in which, President Klaus, you have great experience as a man who was very successful in reviving, transforming and reviving the economy of Czechoslovakia. Let me ask you this. At the moment, the record of growth of unemployment and generally of initiative, economic initiative in Western Europe in particular, is rather weak. And it doesn't seem to be doing particularly well. Furthermore, you have the problems associated first with the 2008 crash and secondly with the euro. So is the optimism, economic optimism, of the first 10 or 15 years of the post-Cold War world now vanished, or not the optimism, but the prospects for a better economic future?
I feel very optimistic about Poland. I think that we don't have the positive narrative from Poland. Poland is, the GDP is going up, Moody's ranking it higher. We don't have a problem with the economy. We have a problem with the media. We have a problem with the message getting across. I think in the last year or so, we really are going forward. I have been to several, it's not only that I visit Polish people around the world, but but I travel with other ministers, and we have an awful lot going on in Poland. So as regards my country, I feel very optimistic.
Well, it is true that Poland's record has been very good, I think, over there. But let me turn to President.
Well, I must say that in the moment of the fall of communism, in the moment of our Velvet Revolution, as we used to call it in Czechoslovakia, our dream was freedom, pluralistic parliamentary democracy, and market economy. As I always stress, market economy without adjectives. That was what we got now, at least in the last decade or 2 decades, is definitely not freedom, not pluralistic parliamentary democracy, and not free markets in Europe. In many respects, the European economy is as regulated, as really regulated that in the late communism, when communism was already soft and unable to be tough and to function. So for me, the economic system in Europe is very far from our dreams, and we were dreamers as well, you know. And the free markets are not there, and I'm afraid in the United States of America also not. You mentioned euro. Euro was a tragic mistake to introduce in Europe, which is a debilitating project, and I wrote books about it. There is no time to develop those points. But this is the reality in our part of the world. You mentioned the rate of unemployment growing. You know, I must say that the Czech Republic has the lowest unemployment rate in Europe these days. Our almost crazy rate of unemployment is 2.6%, which is economically, for an economist, it's an unsound figure, creating pressures in the labor market. But there are differences among countries. Poland is definitely very efficiently, very cleverly using all the European subsidies, and it helped very much. It helped very much for them. For me, our idea was to not only to privatize, to deregulate, to de-subsidize the economy.
You and I have to have a drink together.
And
this is not a conversation for public.
We wanted to, and we did it. We eliminated all kinds of subsidies, and to our great regret, subsidies are coming back through the European Union, something we don't want and which creates lots of problems. So that would be a different topic to speak about the economic system in Europe. My topic, I would be pleased to do it.
Do you want to come in on this, Leo?
No.
Well, I think
I
think
can, but I won't
I think
because of time.
that's a prudent decision. I would like to now turn to the question of democracy, because as we know, this is now a subject of great debate and contestation on both sides of the Atlantic. I want to suggest very briefly there seem to be two battles. One is the European Union and some of and particularly France and Germany, are critical of what's happening, as they say, in Poland and Hungary, but elsewhere too, in which they allege that courts are restricted, the media is controlled, and democratic decisions, even though there may be elections, are not really true and free and fair. On the other hand, the critics of the EU quote Ralph Dahrendorf, a former commissioner, who said that if the EU tried to join the EU, it wouldn't be accepted because it didn't meet the democratic criteria. And therefore, the charges against Poland, Hungary, and other countries fall by the wayside because they're not made by a democratic institution. So I want to ask Anna Maria, first to respond.
I knew you were going to ask me first. Let me go back to a conversation that I had with Senator McCain when the government changed in Poland. He and a number of other senators sent a letter to Poland saying they were worried about democracy, they were worried about the Supreme Court, and so on and so forth. I met him several months after that letter, and I said, well, Senator, why would you say this? Well, he says this and this and this and this. And I said, well, where are you getting your information from? He says, well, I only ever get one-sided information. I think we are still dealing with the problem of information. So, as President Obama liked to say, let me be clear. First of all, you can read any newspaper you like in Poland. They are certainly not all friendly. We have 2 tabloids that regularly bash us, and Gazeta Wyborcza, which is also not friendly. Nobody writing on there in those papers ends up in jail. We have had God knows how many protests in the street. Nobody ends up in jail. So I was asked by a Democratic senator, that same visit when I met with Senator McCain, what about women's rights in Poland? And how many women are in the party? And I am flabbergasted that we get this bad press, and we still get this bad press. There are several people who write continuously in the United States who are always bashing the government. At the moment, we are told they are not democratic because, well, we have several issues. We have a problem with the migrants, and we definitely have the problem with the courts. Where we are told that we are now controlling the courts. That is a long subject, and I don't want to get into that. That needs its own separate debate. But I really honestly think that to accuse Poland of being a non-democratic country, we want to have our identity. We do not want, we were under communist rule for so many years, we want to have our identity. Let me go back to what Ronald Reagan said, let Poland be Poland. That's what we want. We want Poland to be Poland, and we do not want to be ruled by the EU.
You know, John, what is so hard for me to figure out is that people keep criticizing Hungary and Poland for all of these anti-democratic measures which they're allegedly carrying out. And yet, the last time that I looked at it, I believe that the present government in Hungary has been elected 3 elections in a row by a 2/3 majority, the people, right, speaking out. And I believe in Poland, at least the last election, at least the last several elections, the same way. So the people are voting democratically, providing majorities. The government is moving ahead, and isn't that democracy in action? So perhaps we, America, shouldn't be quite so quick to criticize our friends and allies over there, and just let them go about their business as their people seem to want to do.
Of course, one of the charges is that in these countries, the great majority of newspapers, particularly in Hungary, it is said, are under all support one party, which I think could never happen in the United States. Professor Klaus?
Talking about the EU, I have a real problem, because it was me, as Prime Minister, who sent a letter to Brussels in January 1996 asking for membership in the EU. And it was me who, in April 2004, as president of the country, signed the entry into the EU. There was no other chance for an ex-communist or post-communist country. We had no chance to do it differently. We didn't have the luxury of being an independent Switzerland. We didn't have the luxury of being an island close to Europe as Great Britain. So we couldn't afford, we were in the heart of Europe, surrounded on all sides by EU members, so we had no other chance. Nevertheless, I am, since the very beginning, someone who opposes the wrong idea of European unification. I am very much in favor of European integration, which was the beginning of the European process. Unification is a post-democratic concept which I can't agree with. So my idea, I was applauding Brexit decision, and I think either the countries would leave the EU or the EU would undergo a radical, systematic transformation, a real substantial change. Otherwise, the EU has no future. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There are 2 representatives of the Czech embassy here, so I am sure they are already now reporting to the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs what I am saying here.
I think we now have 3 minutes to go. I'm going to ask you a question about one of the issues of the day, populism. That is now a major force in Europe which is growing in importance. Is populism a dangerous threat to democracy on the one hand, or is populism instead a democratic response to the fact that remote elites have been imposing policies on the European countries which the people don't want and which they're now rebelling against and going to populist parties for it? And the second half of that question is, if Reagan and Thatcher were here today, it wouldn't really apply to the Pope, would they be described as populists?
I think that you must make a distinction between historical populism and modern populism. Right, the people. A populist party is a party which represents the people, the will of the people. I'm talking about modern populism. And here in America, we have had, particularly in the Republican side, we have had a string of populism since Barry Goldwater, since Ronald Reagan, since the moral majority, since the Tea Party, since even President Trump. All of that is populist, expressing the will of the people, and those populists are saying limited government, free enterprise, strong national defense, classic American ideals. John, let me say, I know we only got about a minute and a half just to throw in my 2 cents in terms of taking something out of today's brilliant, hasn't it been marvelous? Hasn't it? I mean, the quality of the panels and of the moderators has been fantastic. And
Especially
believe me,
the moderator.
right, particularly the moderator. And I've been to a hell of a lot of these things in my life, and this is one of the best things I've ever been to. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave two phrases, two ideas, one from the Pope and one from President Reagan. From the Pope, be not afraid. That's what I'm taking away from this meeting is be not afraid, be not afraid. And with Ronald Reagan, it's that famous Thomas Paine one, which is, we have it in our power to make over the world again. And I think if we can take those away from us, they can inspire us to make the necessary advances, the necessary reforms that we need to make this country and this world a lot better. Thank you, John, for indulging me.
I'm going to ask you that.
Those were almost the concluding words, just 2 sentences. First, I hope I will never make a mistake using the term populism or the adjective populist in my speeches, in my remarks. This is a label, this is a wrong label, misused label. This is not an analytical term, so I would suggest never allow people to use the term populism because it's an artificial attack of the political elites on all those who disagree with what is going on. This is my very strong statement. And second, optimism. You know, there is a German, famous German saying, "Optimismus ist Pflicht," which means optimism is an obligation. So I agree.
Yes.
Optimism is a
very
Pflicht.
quickly, if I may.
I agree with everything Lee said, so I just rest my case.
Well, I'm afraid we don't have time for the last question, which was going to be, is Emmanuel Macron the man who is going to save Europe?
That's too bad.
May I ask you to show your appreciation for a tremendous panel?
Thank you.